Just after midnight, Pope Leo XIV entered the Vatican private archive and locked the door behind him. 3 meetings disappeared from his schedule, his private line went silent, and no one inside the apostolic palace knew what he was looking for. 4 hours later, the head of papal security forced the lock and found him sitting on the floor with an old folder spread open beside him and a map of Iraq across his knees. 2 cardinals remained motionless in the doorway as the Pope lifted his eyes. His hands were trembling, but his voice was controlled when he said that he was going to Mosul the next day. Around him were hundreds of letters from Iraqi bishops, priests, and families, some more than 20 years old, all received by Rome and left without an answer. The folder carried one faded word: Nineveh. Inside it were records of people who had hidden beneath churches, crossed deserts to protect sacred objects, searched for missing children, and waited for reconstruction money that had already been donated but never arrived. At the back of the file, one handwritten instruction revealed that the silence had not been accidental. Do not respond, do not act, wait. The handwriting belonged to someone still alive and still serving inside the Vatican. By the time dawn reached Rome, Pope Leo XIV had made 2 decisions. Every name connected to the folder would be identified, and the Church would no longer remain silent about Iraq. The first pages carried the account of 40 people who had hidden beneath a church in Mosul for 3 days without water. Another letter described a young priest who had walked 70 miles across the desert, carrying a single stone relic, because he believed it would be destroyed if he left it behind. Pope Leo XIV read both records without speaking, then turned to the next name. A mother had written to Rome 3 times, asking for help finding her 2 sons. No answer came, and 2 years later, both men were found in a shallow grave outside Karakosh. Another village had been promised reconstruction funds that donors had already transferred, but somewhere between Rome and Erbil, the money had disappeared into accounts no one could fully trace. Then the Pope reached the letter of a teenage girl who had copied an entire Aramaic prayer book by hand during 6 months in hiding. The original had been burned, and she feared that the language itself might disappear with it. She sent the copy to Rome with one request: "Please, do not let us be forgotten." The letter had been received, entered into the record, and left unanswered. He read that page 3 times before placing it beside the map of Iraq. The next file concerned a deacon kidnapped in 2014 and a ransom quietly raised by a Catholic foundation in Belgium. The money had been transferred to Rome for safekeeping, but after the deacon was murdered, it was neither returned to the foundation nor delivered to his family. At the back of the folder, a small note had been attached in careful Italian handwriting. It contained a direct order: "Do not respond, do not act, wait." The handwriting belonged to someone still alive, someone still holding office inside the Vatican, and the Pope understood that the silence surrounding Iraq had not been neglect alone. The Pope did not sleep before dawn. He called the young Peruvian priest who had served as his closest aide since the years when he was still a bishop, and placed the Nineveh folder in front of him. His instruction was precise: identify every name, every signature, and every initial connected to the file, and bring the complete list before sunrise the following day. The aide hesitated because several of the names belonged to powerful men who remained in office. Pope Leo XIV did not look away from the folder. He told the priest that their continued power was exactly why the list had to be completed. By 9 in the morning, the first signs of resistance had already appeared. A senior official attempted to enter the archive, but was stopped by a Swiss guard acting under direct papal order. Another official called the Pope's private line and discovered that it had been disconnected, while a written request for a meeting was returned unopened with a single handwritten word on the envelope. By noon, the disturbance had moved beyond the Vatican walls. A French news outlet reported that something unusual had taken place inside the Apostolic Palace during the night, and an Italian newspaper soon added that every morning meeting had been cancelled without explanation. At 3 in the afternoon, the Vatican press office issued a restrained statement claiming that the Holy Father was in private prayer. The statement concealed what was actually happening. Pope Leo XIV was speaking by telephone with the Chaldean Patriarch in Baghdad, and the conversation lasted 46 minutes. When the call ended, the Pope did not return to the archive because the next decision required him to confront the institution that had allowed the letters to remain unanswered. When the 46-minute conversation with the Chaldean Patriarch ended, Pope Leo XIV left the telephone and walked directly into the Secretariat of State. He did not knock, and he did not wait for an invitation. He placed the Nineveh folder on the central desk and ordered every page published by Friday. The secretary's face changed before he answered. He warned that publication would expose donors, damage relationships built over decades, and endanger sensitive arrangements with 3 governments. The Pope listened until the explanation was finished, then told him that those arrangements were precisely the problem. Before the secretary could continue, the door opened and one of the most powerful cardinals in the Roman Curia entered without permission. He had served 3 popes, survived every internal transition, and understood how authority moved through the Vatican. He looked at the folder, then at the Pope, and warned that 50 years of careful work were about to be destroyed. Pope Leo XIV stood and walked around the desk until only a short distance remained between them. He asked the cardinal one quiet question. What had that careful work been for? The cardinal opened his mouth, closed it again, and remained silent because no answer could survive the evidence lying on the desk. The Pope stepped past him and left the room. The cardinal remained alone for nearly 5 minutes before walking into the corridor, where 2 officials saw that his expression had changed. But the confrontation was not finished, because the secretary now admitted that the Nineveh folder was incomplete and that a second file existed somewhere else. The second folder was not stored in the archive. It was kept inside a private safe that did not appear on any official Vatican inventory, and the secretary now stood between the Pope and the only person who knew how to open it. His hands were damp as he insisted that he lacked the authority to proceed. Pope Leo XIV answered without raising his voice. He gave the authorization directly, but the secretary refused again and cited a requirement for 3 votes, established procedures, and reasons that could not be ignored. The Pope walked toward the door and told him that the safe would be opened with or without his cooperation. By evening, another official had carried out the papal order. The safe was opened, the second folder was removed, and the contents were brought to the Pope. Unlike the first file, it did not contain appeals from Iraqi Christians. It contained replies drafted inside the Vatican over nearly 30 years. Some promised direct intervention, others committed millions in reconstruction funding, and several identified wealthy families, foundations, and a government prepared to support churches across the Nineveh Plains. None of those replies had ever reached Iraq. Each document carried the same institutional wound. Someone had stopped the answer before it could leave Rome, and the pattern had continued across decades, administrations, and pontificates. The first folder proved that people had written for help, but the second proved that the Vatican had known how to respond and had chosen not to send the response. Pope Leo XIV read the names attached to the unsent replies one by one. A major European foundation had publicly presented itself as a defender of persecuted Christians. A wealthy American family, whose name appeared on hospitals and universities across the United States, had also pledged support that never reached the people for whom it had been intended. Then he reached the name of a government aligned with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. For 2 decades, its officials had described their country as a friend of Iraqi Christians and had spoken at the United Nations about protecting the same communities named in the letters. The documents showed that public solidarity had existed beside private pressure, delayed action, and assistance that never arrived. The Pope rose from the table and walked to the window of the Apostolic Palace. Rome was already dark below him, but the institutional pattern had become clear. The Vatican had not simply failed to answer suffering. It had allowed carefully drafted answers, pledged money, and external commitments to disappear inside its own structure. He said quietly that the Church had been lying for 30 years. The words were not directed at the secretary or at any single official, because the evidence reached beyond one office and one generation. At that moment, exposure became more than a publication decision. The Pope decided that the correspondence would be released, but he also understood that disclosure without action would repeat the same failure in a different form. The unanswered letters required a direct response. The missing aid required a new system, and Iraq itself could no longer remain a distant subject managed through intermediaries. By the next morning, the Vatican had entered survival mode. A leak, containing details too precise to be accidental, had reached 3 news agencies overnight, and the press office began preparing denials before the full story could escape its control. Pope Leo XIV ordered the denials stopped and said that truth was no longer negotiable. He summoned 12 cardinals to the Sala Bologna, selecting men younger than the institution usually trusted. With moments of this scale, the Pope remained standing at the head of the long marble table and placed 3 documents before them. The first announced the suppressed correspondence and its imminent publication, while the second established a permanent Vatican mission in the Nineveh Plains with direct authority and no intermediaries. The third document was a flight manifest bearing the Pope's own name. Its destination was Erbil, and its departure was scheduled within 48 hours. The room broke into objections concerning intelligence clearance, months of missing preparation, political consequences, and the possibility of division inside the Church. The Pope allowed every cardinal to finish. He did not interrupt when they warned that the journey could become a political act rather than a pastoral one, and he did not answer until the last voice had fallen silent. Then he ordered them to sit and spoke for less than 2 minutes. For 30 years, he said, Iraqi families had written to the Church while their letters were placed in drawers. Money had been collected in their name, statements of solidarity had been delivered, and the promised help had not followed. He would not become the 4th pope to do nothing, and he was not asking the cardinals for permission. An older cardinal rose carefully and asked what would happen to the donors and the officials named in the evidence. Pope Leo XIV answered that the names would be released on Friday morning with dates, signatures, and the trail behind every decision. The cardinal's face went pale, because everyone at the table understood that publication would end careers, destroy reputations, and open the path to criminal investigations. The next 12 hours exposed how quickly resistance could organize itself inside the Vatican. Some officials supported the Pope without hesitation, while others reached for procedure, delay, and quiet obstruction. A smaller group moved against the trip itself, calculating that if the journey could be stopped, the publication might still be contained. That night, 2 members of the Pope's personal security detail were reassigned without his approval. The order had not come from him, and within an hour he removed 3 officials from their posts. He replaced them with younger, lesser-known personnel who carried no debt to the old structure and no reason to protect it. Outside the Vatican walls, governments began demanding answers. 2 embassies sent urgent overnight communications to the Holy See, while an unnamed intelligence service requested an emergency consultation. Through his aide, the Pope refused and stated that he would not negotiate his schedule with anyone. In Iraq, preparations had already begun. The Chaldean Patriarch in Baghdad activated a small team, an unmarked flight carried personnel from Erbil to Baghdad, and a half-destroyed church outside Mosul was quietly cleared for a possible papal visit. No public announcement had been made, but every movement now pointed toward departure. Then, on the second night, the pressure changed form. At approximately 11 at night, a sealed envelope appeared inside the Pope's private apartments without a sender, a stamp, or a return address. It had not been placed there to delay him through procedure. At approximately 11 at night, the sealed envelope was found on a side table in the outer reception room of the Pope's private apartments. It carried no sender, no stamp, and no return address. No guard could explain who had brought it inside, and no member of the household staff admitted seeing anyone place it there. The Pope opened the envelope in the presence of his young aide. Inside was a single sheet containing 8 names, all of them belonging to Vatican officials. Each name was followed by a date, and each date was connected to a specific decision involving aid that had been suppressed, redirected, or quietly canceled. The list was not vague. It included internal reference codes that could only have been known by someone with direct access to the administrative trail. The dates aligned with the correspondence already found in the 2 folders, which meant the sender was not inventing accusations but pointing the Pope toward a documented chain of responsibility. At first, the page appeared to be an attempt to help him. It identified the exact officials who had intervened and linked each of them to a decision that had affected Iraqi families. But the message written beneath the list changed the meaning of the envelope. The warning stated that if the Pope published the names, he would not return from Iraq alive. He read the sentence twice, folded the page along its original crease, and placed it carefully on his desk. His aide remained standing beside him, waiting for an order that might delay the trip. Pope Leo XIV gave a different instruction. He told the aide to add the page to the file. The priest froze, then warned that the threat had to be taken seriously and urged him to postpone the journey, even if only for 1 week. The Pope looked at him with complete calm. He said that if one threat could force a delay, every future threat would acquire the same power. The journey would continue, the names would be published, and the discussion was over. He went to bed at 1 in the morning and slept for 4 hours. Before entering his bedroom, however, he remained in his private office and wrote a personal letter by hand. The letter filled 3 pages and was addressed to his eventual successor, whoever that person might one day be. When he finished, he sealed the pages and placed them inside a small case kept in the private office. The instruction written on the outside was direct. The letter was to be opened only if he did not return from Iraq. 2 of his closest aides were informed that the letter existed, but neither was permitted to read it. One of those aides later remembered that the Pope had written the entire letter while standing. He did not appear frightened, and he did not pause as though reconsidering the journey. He looked like a man who had already accepted the personal cost of the decision and had turned his attention entirely toward what had to happen if he failed to come back. At 7 in the morning, the Vatican press office released a statement only 3 lines long. The first line announced that suppressed correspondence between the Vatican and Iraqi Christian communities, extending back nearly 3 decades, would be published within 24 hours. The second announced the immediate establishment of a permanent Vatican mission in the Nineveh Plains, and the third confirmed that Pope Leo XIV would begin his personal journey to Mosul that same day. The Vatican press room erupted before officials had finished distributing the statement. Veteran journalists who had covered 3 popes began calling editors, embassies, and government ministries at once. Several later said they had never witnessed an announcement that combined disclosure, institutional reform, and personal papal risk with so little warning. Telephones began ringing across government buildings throughout Europe. The United States Department of State issued a cautious and deliberately vague response within 40 minutes, while a senior French minister called the announcement premature. A British broadcaster described it as a moral earthquake. During a live television discussion, a Middle Eastern analyst stopped speaking for nearly 20 seconds. When he finally answered, he said that he did not know what to say because the decision changed everything. Pope Leo XIV offered no public explanation because by then he had already left Rome. The aircraft was small and carried no journalists. No cardinal associated with the older curial structure had been given a seat. The passengers were limited to a representative of the Chaldean Patriarch, a translator, 2 newly appointed security agents, and the young Peruvian aide carrying the suppressed correspondence in a sealed container. The flight to Erbil lasted 4 hours. Halfway through the journey, the Pope rose from his seat and walked slowly through the cabin, looking directly at each person aboard. He told them that whatever happened after landing, publication was not to be stopped. He made the instruction more precise. If he failed to return, every page was still to be released on Friday morning. He waited until each person had nodded, then returned to his seat and remained silent for the rest of the flight. When the aircraft landed in Erbil, there was no red carpet and no state ceremony. 3 vehicles waited beside a small group of local clergy, while a Chaldean bishop stood at the bottom of the steps and wept openly. The Pope descended, embraced him, and spoke quietly enough that no one else heard the words. 2 days later, the bishop revealed what had been said. Pope Leo XIV had asked forgiveness, admitted that Rome had been wrong, and said he had come to repair what could still be repaired. Even though the answer had arrived 30 years late, he had come. The convoy left Erbil and moved toward the Nineveh plains. For the next 4 hours, the journey became the most dangerous stage of the trip. At one checkpoint, intelligence reports warned that an unidentified group might be monitoring the route, and the Pope was advised to turn back. He refused without argument. He gave the driver one instruction: drive. The vehicles continued, and approximately 30 minutes later, the convoy entered a stretch of road that had not appeared in the original security plan. The route had been changed at the last moment to avoid an undisclosed problem. The driver of the lead vehicle later confirmed that the alteration had been necessary, but no official account explained what danger had forced it. Soon afterward, 2 unmarked vehicles appeared behind the convoy. They followed for nearly 12 kilometers. No one spoke inside the Pope's car while the distance between the vehicles remained unchanged. The security agents watched the road, the aide watched the Pope, and the Pope kept his eyes outside the window. The 2 vehicles finally turned onto a side road and disappeared. Only then did the aide ask whether the Pope was all right. Pope Leo XIV did not answer directly and asked how much farther they had to travel. The aide told him that approximately 20 minutes remained. The Pope nodded, returned his attention to the road, and said nothing more until the convoy reached the half-rebuilt church outside Mosul. The convoy stopped outside a half-rebuilt church in a small village beyond Mosul. The Pope entered alone for the first few minutes, without cameras or officials beside him. Parts of the walls were still scorched, half the roof had been replaced, and the remaining section was blackened by a fire set nearly a decade earlier. He did not kneel in prayer first. He lowered himself to the floor and placed his hand against the burn marks. He remained there long enough for the people waiting outside to understand that he was not moving through the ruins as part of a ceremony. When he finally stood, his eyes were red. Nearly 200 people had gathered outside the church, including families who had walked for hours to reach the village. The Pope faced them and said that the church would not hide anymore. The reaction moved through the crowd at once. Mothers began weeping, elderly men knelt in the dust, and a boy, approximately 7 years old, broke through the line and seized the Pope's hand. Pope Leo XIV held it for almost a full minute without speaking. A woman standing behind the child tried to address him, stopped, and then forced herself to begin again. She said that her older son had been killed in 2017 and that she had written to the Vatican 7 times. She had counted every letter and kept copies of them all. The Pope turned toward his aide and ordered him to record her name. Every one of the 7 letters was to be located by the following day. The aide wrote the instruction down while the woman remained before the Pope without asking for compensation, punishment, or public recognition. She asked only whether her son's name would be found in the Vatican archive. Pope Leo XIV took both of her hands and told her that the name had already been there. The failure belonged to those in Rome who had not read it, and he said that failure would now end. The woman nodded slowly and stepped back into the crowd. The Pope then turned toward the small group of cameras permitted near the church. He told the families that their unanswered letters would now receive actions rather than promises or statements. He reached inside his coat and removed a sealed envelope. Holding it where the crowd could see it, he described it as the first answer and said that others would follow. He then placed the envelope in the hands of the local bishop. The contents were not released publicly for another 6 hours. When the bishop opened it, he found a signed papal decree divided into several sections. The first created a fund of 100 million euros, financed through the planned sale of specified Vatican assets and reserved exclusively for Christian and minority communities in the Nineveh Plains. The money was to move through direct disbursement. There would be no intermediaries and no political filters between the Vatican and the communities receiving the assistance. The first transfer was ordered to begin within 2 weeks. The second section established a permanent Vatican mission in the Nineveh Plains with full diplomatic and humanitarian authority. It was described as the first mission of its kind anywhere in the world. Its leader would not be a senior official sent from Rome, but a local bishop from the region. The third section ordered the immediate publication of the suppressed correspondence. Every name, date, signature, blocked payment, redirected contribution, and government communication pressuring the Holy See to remain silent would be released. The 8 officials listed in the anonymous warning were each connected to a documented decision, and each decision was tied directly or indirectly to human loss. A fourth section had not appeared in any public announcement. The local bishop found it only after unfolding the decree completely. It consisted of a single page containing 63 names. Each name belonged to an Iraqi Christian who had written to the Vatican between 1996 and 2024. Beside each person were 2 dates: the day the letter was received in Rome and the day the writer died through violence, displacement, hunger, or despair. Some had waited years, others months, and in 2 cases fewer than 7 days separated the arrival of the letter from the death of the person who sent it. The bishop did not read the names aloud. He moved through them in silence for nearly an hour, while a priest remained seated beside him. When he reached the final entry, he said that the Pope would remember every one of them. At the bottom of the decree, Pope Leo XIV had signed his name by hand. Above the signature, he had written a title for the entire document. It read, "To those who waited." The consequences began within hours of publication. 2 senior Vatican officials resigned before sundown. A third was placed under canonical investigation the following morning, and a major European foundation issued a defensive statement before announcing an internal review. A wealthy American family responded through lawyers, while a government aligned with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization canceled 3 scheduled press briefings and recalled a senior diplomat from Rome without explanation. In one country, a parliamentary committee demanded an emergency hearing. In another, a public prosecutor announced that he would review the documents personally. A journalist who had spent nearly a decade investigating the same missing funds was suddenly contacted by editors who had once rejected his work, and he said that the Pope had finally proved what others had refused to examine. The Pope did not leave Mosul immediately. He visited 2 more churches, stopped at a school being rebuilt by Yazidi families, and met separately with Sunni and Shia clerics without cameras. He made no formal speeches and spent most of the meetings listening. A Sunni imam thanked him for coming, but the Pope answered that gratitude was misplaced because Rome was 30 years late. He asked for help, ensuring that no community would ever be forced to wait that long again. The imam began to weep, and the translator later said it was the only time he had seen a religious leader cry openly during a private meeting. During another meeting, a Yazidi elder placed a small stone from the ruins of Sinjar on the table. His daughter had carried it when the family fled the mountain in 2014, but she had not survived the journey. The Pope held the stone in both hands and said he would carry it back to Rome so that anyone who called the suffering distant could be made to feel its weight. When Pope Leo XIV returned to Rome, he was met by silence rather than celebration. One Vatican official admitted that no one yet understood what kind of church had emerged from the confrontation. In his first public address, the Pope spoke for less than 4 minutes and declared that truth and justice were not negotiable, even when they arrived 30 years late. More consequences followed. 3 additional names from the original list were confirmed by independent reporting. A 4th official resigned, and a 5th came under criminal review in his home country. The first 150 pages of suppressed correspondence were released, while construction began on the permanent Vatican mission in the Nineveh Plains. The local bishop chosen to lead the mission was later asked what message he had for the 8 officials whose names had been published. He said that he forgave them, but he would not forget them, and neither would the families who had waited. Inside Rome, supporters called the decision a choice of truth over comfort, while opponents warned that the Pope had created enemies he could not yet see. The confrontation did not end with Iraq. 4 additional regional folders were removed from the archive, including files concerning West Africa, South Asia, Latin America, and events closer to Rome. Those around the Pope said he slept less, read more, and had stopped delegating the work. In the 72 hours between opening the Nineveh folder and placing the decree into the bishop's hands outside Mosul, Pope Leo XIV forced the Church to confront what it had filed away for nearly 30 years. The unanswered letters were now public, the names were attached to decisions, and the promises that never reached Iraq could no longer disappear behind procedure. The door had opened, and the institution could not close it again.